Thank you very much. I have no prepared remarks. I see all these folks and they've got like these incredible booklets and everything's like, in like 43 fonts so they can read it. I'm just going to warn you, I'm actually a really, really disorganized presenter. Very, very dependent upon slides, which I am going to put up currently, and I hope, wow, that was a big head. So first of all, thank you very much for having me here. I'm very honored. I am part of a network of professionals who are really all over the world trying to better understand the impact of experiences on development. And for the longest time, we focused on the impact of bad experiences and studied how that impacted the development of the brain and then the brain's functions, including thinking and feeling and behaving. And so our work had relevance for just about every system you can think of. Public education, mental health, child welfare, and we were very interested in trying to help people in public systems better understand these issues, because we felt that if you understood what had happened, that you all would be able to figure out how to make those systems change in the way they put together programs and practices to hopefully address some of those problems. And we continued to do that, but along the way we realized that you all needed a little help. So we decided to also start focusing on what's the impact of positive experiences? What's the counterbalance to these bad things? And are there things that we can do that will influence the systems in the brain that have been impacted by trauma, neglect, and adversity that will actually lead to repair, recovery, and so forth? And so we now have a very significant body of our work, and many, many, many programs across the world are actively and intentionally looking at what we would call therapeutic approaches. And some of that's very positive. So what I want to share with you a little bit today is why what you're doing is so important. And then I want to give you a little bit of an exposure to some of the concepts that we think are really important as we collectively go through the process of inventing new ways of doing our work. Because make no mistake about it, we are inventing new things. One of the great things about the human brain, and I'll talk about this a tiny little bit, is that it's remarkably malleable. It's capable of changing. And one of the properties of the human brain, which is unique to our species, is that the human brain can actually absorb more bits of information per second than any other species. And what that means is we can make memory faster and more efficiently. And that means that we're able to learn things and we're able to pass things on to the next generation. And so the truth is, we live currently very, very differently than we did 5,000 years ago. And the process of socio-cultural evolution, the process of inventing new things that we incorporate into everyday life, involves changing the brain. And part of what I want to do is make you sit back and realize that you are part of an active, intentional process of inventing new things. And I want to give you some principles and concepts that I think will help you in that process. But let me just start with this way. I think people learn best in context of stories and narratives, and also I'll probably end up talking about a lot of different stories, and I'll have my presentation will seem fragmented and all over the place. But there's a method to my madness, and what I want to start with is a little bit of a sobering look at how well our current systems collectively are doing with very complex trauma. Because of our work, as I mentioned before, that our work has relevance for a lot of our public systems. And one of the things that many of you realize, I think, is that in the states that have the death penalty, there are essentially mitigating factors that can be taken into consideration when the jury or the judge is trying to decide whether or not a person gets life or gets the death penalty. And so I don't get involved in the legal system that much. How many lawyers are in this room? Y'all make it very uncomfortable for people who are not lawyers in your system. So I try to avoid it as much as possible. But there are times when I think it's really important that we, people who have expertise, share that with people in courts, because their decision-making will be better if they have better information. And so when I feel like I can learn something from participating in these cases, I will occasionally do this work. And this is from a real live case about 5 years ago. Someone in a western state, not Arizona, went in with a couple of his friends into a bar at closing time. There were 5 people in there. He kind of panicked, thought maybe somebody had recognized him, so he killed everybody in a very brutal way. And so he was found guilty, and this is from the sentencing phase. And in the sentencing phase, one of the things that you can consider as a potential mitigating factor is a history of mental illness or a history of child abuse and so forth. So this is a family tree of this individual right here. Here's the individual that did the murders. This is a family tree looking at the maternal side. These are called genograms, for those of you, most people I think are familiar with these in a little bit. This is the paternal genogram. This is what happens if we put into the maternal genogram the individuals who were impacted by documented alcohol or drug abuse. This is what happens when you put in the paternal side. This is what happens when you put in and add this history of mental health problems. And now, again, those of you who've done this kind of work know that when you both interview people and you review records, when you get positive endorsements of these things, that's usually even an underestimate of how bad it was. So what you're seeing is an underestimate of what this child's and person's life was like. So this is the mental health problems. This is the paternal side mental health problems. This is when you add in the people in the maternal side who were involved in jail or the juvenile justice system. This is the paternal side. This is when you add in the documented cases of child abuse and domestic violence. This is the maternal side. This is the paternal side. This is when you add in the documented cases of sexual assault or sexual abuse on the maternal side and the paternal side. And when you start to think about this, look at this. Here's what I want you to hear. This person, before he killed 5 other people, and oh, by the way, we're now paying $50,000 a year to keep him in jail, and we will for the next 50 plus years, because he's a young man. So we're going to spend at least $2.5 million from this point forward keeping him. He did not get the death penalty, but he got life in prison, and we'll spend $2.5 million keeping him in prison. We spent over $1 million, we estimated, getting him to the point from birth to the point that he murdered people. So we've spent $3.5 million public dollars on this person. Now, he had 64 contacts with public systems that had the intention of helping him or diverting him out of a bad trajectory from the time he was conceived to the time he murdered those people. 64 times. Early intervention programs, high-risk pregnancy programs, early Head Start, special ed programs, mental health programs, probation programs, 64 times. Well-intended, publicly funded professionals looked at his circumstances through the lens of traditional mental health perspective, traditional child welfare perspective, traditional special education perspective, traditional education perspective, none of them trauma-informed, none of them developmentally informed. Good people, smart people, hardworking, well-funded, and he ended up killing these people. This is why what you're doing today is so important. It's not like we don't have enough money. This isn't a matter of money. And it's not a matter of goodwill. And it's not a matter of smart people. It's a matter of tools. You have been trying to build a house with one tool. You need more tools in your toolkit. People who do this work need to understand attachment. They need to understand the impact of stress on development. They need to understand healthy and appropriate models of discipline that don't involve shaming and punishment and exclusion and expelling. The very systems that were intended to help him actually made him worse. They misunderstood his behaviors, and they marginalized him, and they kicked him out, and they punished him. They were well-intended, but they made things worse. And I can guarantee you right now, I hate to say it, in this great city, right now, I'll bet there's at least 10 or 15 episodes that will take place over the course of this morning where a kid is misunderstood in school and is punished and marginalized and demoralized, and he will not want to come back to school tomorrow. And the probability is that that's a child of color and a child who's poor. And the probability is that because we didn't provide a trauma-informed, developmentally appropriate set of expectations and services for that child, he will end up consuming our time, energy, effort, and tax dollars in our other systems. Our police officers will get to know him. Our probation officers will get to know him. This is why what you're doing is so important. Now, this is not something that particularly new to any of you. Most of you have run into kids like this or families like this in the course of your work. The good news is that these things can improve. You can do work that will help children and youth who have been impacted by adversity. And you can educate all of these systems, ranging from the smartest person in an academic setting down to the least educated person who spends time with a child as could be a primary caregiver, could be somebody who takes care of the child in an early childhood setting. Every one of those individuals can better understand these kids, and when they do, the outcomes are astoundingly positive. So, let's talk about some of the good news, bad news stuff. One of the things about the brain is that it grows very, very, very rapidly early in life. And one of the things about the brain that I think most of you already know is that it's got all of these really complex networks that allow us to do a whole range of amazing things. So when you actually have a good thought, that's because something's going on in your brain. When you move your fingers, that's because your brain allows you to move your fingers in a certain way. When you see things, when you hear things, your brain mediates so many interesting and complex functions. It's a remarkable organ. But it's a complex organ. And one of the things that we've been trying to do in our work is take the known complexities about how the brain works and functions and see whether or not there are ways we can translate that into concepts and principles and language that people who are not trained as neuroscientists can actually appreciate and understand and incorporate into their work. And so that's part of what I want to do today. I want to talk a little bit about this, about the brain and some of these concepts that I think can be helpful in your work. But I want to do it, I don't want to just default to an overly simple model of the brain. I want you to appreciate how complex it is first, and then I'll talk about the simple part of it, because it's really, you know, I think one of the challenges that we have in our work is that because we've invented this big modern world, we fall prey to the tendency to want to have a one-size-fits-all model. And so we create too many overly simplistic solutions to incredibly complex, diverse problems. And so I really do want you to be challenged to some degree to appreciate this unique quality that every person in front of you has. And then I'll talk about some of the simplification. So let's talk first of all with the brain. You know, the brain's got all of these systems, and one of the things that we do when we teach, you know, whether it's foster parents or educators or clinicians or whoever we're teaching to, we always emphasize the fact that the brain has this interesting hierarchical structure. So you've got this lower part of the brain. Everybody's probably heard of the brain stem. And that part of the brain is involved in a lot of really simple regulatory functions: body temperature regulation, respiration, heart rate, and so forth. And as you go higher in the brain, you get increasingly complex networks. And then you get to the top part of the brain, the cortex, which is the most uniquely human part of the brain, and actually the most uniquely part of your body. So it's no surprise then that the most uniquely human functions are mediated by that part of the brain. So speech and language, future planning, when we talk about executive functioning, it's in large part a cortical set of activities and capabilities. So this interesting thing about our brain is that we've got these systems that are basically organized in a hierarchical way. We go from simple regulatory systems low to these very complex systems at the top part of your brain. And it'll make, you know, you'll be clear about why I'm emphasizing this in a minute. But the other thing I think is really important to understand about the brain is that it is comprised of a lot of moving parts. So your brain has really got a lot of stuff going on. So right now, as you're sitting here, and this is sort of a sobering thing to think about. As you sit here, and if I could look at every single aspect of what's going on in your brain, all of the, you know, the chemicals that are in your brain, the genes that are being turned on and turned off, and you think about all the capabilities you have in this moment, you can think about, you know, your high school days, you can think about your mother, you can think about what does your child look like, you can think about your favorite song, and all the stuff that you have in your brain. The neurobiological networks and the neurobiological conformations that allow you to sort of be who you are right now will be different right now, which is a really mind-blowing concept. That the very same neurobiological networks that allowed you to have all of the functions you had when you walked into this room this morning are going to be slightly different when you walk out of this room today. So your brain is always changing. It is never, ever the same. Now, this is a really positive thing, and this is why the brain is malleable. Those of you who remember your physics, systems that don't have a lot of movement are hard to change. Systems that are in dynamic activity are easier to change. And so the great thing about your brain is the more it is moving and changing, the easier it is to move. The easier it is to change. The more it's moving, the more it's dynamic. So 86 billion neurons, pretty complex, right? So you've got 86 billion neurons, and each one of these neurons has thousands of synaptic connections, places where it comes up against another cell, another neuron, and you release neurotransmitter across this space we call the synapse, and that transmitter, a chemical like norepinephrine, dopamine, serotonin, or a protein like an opioid, enkephalins, endorphins, they actually change the activity of the membrane, and that changes the activity of some biochemical things in the inside of that cell that goes to change things in the genome. And those of you who have heard about epigenetics, that's kind of what we're talking about when we talk about that. But all of this stuff is dynamic. And you've got 1 billion synapses in every tiny little cubic centimeter of brain tissue. And you can go even further. You can look at the inside of one synapse, one synaptic bouton, one presynaptic terminal, and look at all these proteins, and all of this gets even more complex. And it gets more complex because I've just been talking about the component parts of your brain. I haven't been talking about the dynamic activity. So if you start to put together the number of moving parts and the rates at which the simplest of these actually move, the depolarization of a neuron, you get something like 2.5 quadrillion depolarizations in your brain per minute. This is astoundingly complex. And so just think for a minute. Think about how complex that is, and then the overly simplistic explanations that we tend to use for how we understand people's behavior. We're usually not right. Usually not right. We're not, maybe. When you see these commercials that Billy's depressed because he's not releasing enough serotonin, and you're like, I don't think so. It's a lot more complex than that. So, now, as complex as it is, one of the things that we do, we humans do all the time, is that we try to make complex things simple. And when we do that, we basically create these shortcuts. We make little models. We make little drawings. We take things that are really, really complicated and try to make them simple. And so, I'm going to basically tell you something that's a very simple version of how to understand the brain. And I want you to appreciate that everything that I tell you from this point forward isn't true. And I'm not kidding. It's not true. It's inaccurate in some way. But I also want to tell you that every single thing that you ever hear from anybody else about human behavior, about what the reason is, anytime anybody tries to give you a linear explanation about anything that has to do with human beings, it's not true. It may be useful. It may be a useful construct. There may be some truth in that comment, but it is not bedrock true. It's going to be incomplete. It's going to be inadequate in some way. And every single perspective that we have, whether you're a cognitive behavioral person or you're interested in transgenerational trauma or you want to focus on cultural anthropology or economics or whatever, we are all blind men at the elephant. We all see a tiny little piece of this incredibly complex thing that is human life, human existence. And I've only sort of talked a little bit about the complexity of telescoping down into one individual's brain. One of the things that's equally complex is starting to think about what happens when one human being with all that complexity in their brain starts to interact with another person with all the complexity in their brain. And so if you think about it, we're all part of these little different groups. And one of the great things about the human brain is that we're social animals. Human beings are relational creatures. We are neurobiologically organized to be part of a group. We use the word, I want Billy to grow up to be, quote, independent all the time. We talk about independence, but the truth is human beings neurobiologically and physiologically are incapable of independence. We are interdependent. We need each other. We literally our physiology can only be regulated in a healthy way in proximity to other human beings. We are social creatures, which will turn out to be one of the most important aspects of both buffering present stressor and healing from past trauma, relational connection. And it's because of this quality of human connectedness that we are able to both survive and then ultimately to thrive. But I'll come back to that in a minute. Again, complexity. Think about the complexity of all of these different conformations and configurations of alliances and how people get together and can sort of play each other off each other. Any of you who have had multiple kids know what I'm talking about. They'll form little alliances here. And my kids, like the first, the third, and the fifth are one little group. And then the second and the fourth are a different group. And then when they all gang up against us, we know that that's because, they're trying to get something over on us. It's actually, it's a good thing when they're working together. We know it's going to be, they're doing something naughty. But, it's kind of fun to see them work as a team. So, little relational complexity. I'm talking just about sort of the time right now. And what I haven't really introduced is the complexity of transgenerational complexity. Because not only are we connected to the people in our present, we're connected to people in our past in very complex ways, not just in sort of genetic, epigenetic ways, but we're connected in social, cultural ways. And so there are so many confounds if you think about sort of a human in the moment right here, and this is time in one line, and we've got all these connections that are influencing how we function now, and we have all these connections from the past that influence where we are. Our trajectory forward is going to be impacted by all kinds of things. Adversity, connectivity, opportunity, lack of opportunity, marginalization, inclusion, all of these things influence our individual functioning in ways that are both good and bad. And one of the things that's happened, one of the reasons I like to introduce a little bit about this complexity is that I want people to appreciate that one of the major choices that we've made in our public systems to solve the problem of a lot of people living in the same space is to have a tendency to use one-size-fits-all approaches. And I'm not saying this to damn one-size-fits-all approaches. I just want you to understand what happens with one-size-fits-all approaches. So, I'm going to come back and show you, I'm going to do a little science first, and I'm going to come back and talk about one-size-fits-all approaches. So, let's fast forward to this. So, I mentioned this. The brain has this remarkable property to store experience. And one of the fundamental characteristics of how the brain basically stores experiences is that these neural networks that I've been talking about, these neurons and synaptic connections, these things change with repetition. And one of the characteristics of learning and one of the characteristics of memory is that any pattern of neural activity, any sort of networks of neurons that are activated simultaneously end up creating a connection. And this is just one of the fundamentals of how the brain works. Your brain is continually trying to make sense out of the world. And most of you, again, we all learn this like in elementary school, but most of us don't think about this that much. But if you think about your brain right now, the information that's coming into your brain, some of it's coming in visual, right? You see things and you hear things. And there's more, but let's just work on those for right now. So one part of your brain is getting input that's visual, another part of your brain is getting input that's auditory, and it comes into your brain separately. But the picture that your brain creates about this present moment is weaving these things together. It's connecting the sound with the image. And from the time you are in utero, your brain is taking all of this incoming sensory input from the outside world and all the input from your inside of your body, and it's taking these patterns of neural activity and it's trying to make sense out of the world. And so it will connect images and sounds that happen again and again and again and again. That's how you learn language. And this process involves literally moving of neurons. And so this is an old clip, but I just want you to see neurons move. This is dynamic activity of neural networks. The creation, activity-dependent creation of synapses. Pretty cool, right? I had brown hair back then. This was, I first came to Arizona back in 1996. I was talking about this stuff, and I had brown hair. That's crazy. Look at that. All right. So here, let's talk about this for a second. Let's pretend that this neuron right here, I'll stop this. Let's pretend this neuron right here was part of the auditory processing part of the brain. And the neuron over here, this neuron on the bottom is from the visual. And if you hear something and see something and hear something and see something, if it's let's say it's a four-legged furry creature, you see it, you see it, you see it, and every time you see it, you hear a bark, a bark, a bark, a bark, and pretty soon your brain connects the dog with the bark. And later on, when you hear a bark, you can activate the visual part of your brain. You create a visual representation of that, and you go, that's a doggy. And your brain does this with everything. Your brain is continually trying to make sense out of the world based upon what your experiences are. Now, because the brain is most actively developing in utero and in the first years of life, particularly the first year, this process of making sense out of the world is front-loaded to early childhood. Your worldview, the way you understand the world, is by and large a product of your developmental experiences in the first years of your life. That creates the lens through which you see the world. And so if you have a healthy, loving, attentive parent who's always there when you're hungry, thirsty, cold, your brain starts to connect all these attributes of human beings with being fed, with being regulated, with being safe. And then when you go out in the world and you enter school, you see a new human being, a teacher, your brain defaults to, oh, this is a person who's going to be safe and going to be rewarding and going to be kind. And those of you who know this field, this is what we call attachment. Attachment is basically a collection of memories created based upon your earliest developmental experiences with caregivers. And we do this with everything. Those of you interested in implicit bias, it's related to the creation of these associations earlier in your life. Now, I could go off on a whole tangent, which I won't. But the reason I wanted to talk to you about this is that the key point here is that the development of key areas in your brain will be experience dependent. So, if you are a child who hears a lot of words, in your household, by the time you're 2 years old, you will have a vocabulary of 100 words. Or this is a household with a low verbal environment, you'll have a 100-word vocabulary. If you are a 2-year-old and you have been raised in a high verbal environment, you may have a vocabulary as high as 600 words. Now, back to the one-size-fits-all model. We take kids that have come from low verbal environments and high verbal environments, and we put them in the same grade. And this begins to be an issue. And this is not, it's not just with regards to how verbal these kids are. We do this with all kinds of other capabilities. Some kids have fewer social experiences. Some kids have fewer motor experiences. But we put them all together because we're using a one-size-fits-all model of education. And the determinant of where we put a child in this educational track, for example, is based upon their chronological age, not their developmental age. So you're going to have all kinds of kids right here who have heard all these words before, and so when the teacher teaches to the mean, which is basically the only option that teacher has, you've got to teach to the mean because you've got 30 kids in the classroom. These kids will be bored, and these kids will be lost. Now just pay attention to this blue curve to start with. And so what you have is a teacher who is slowly moving the whole group forward. And the academic progress in this classroom is going to be typical. These kids down here were going to act out because they're lost. These kids are going to act out because they're bored. The teacher will spend 25% of his or her time managing that, and the whole group moves along slowly. This is why high-quality homeschooling, those kids move forward much faster. They can achieve academically much faster. Among there's other factors there, but that's one of the factors. Now the thing I want you to focus on a little bit is this red group. The red group, that is kids who've grown up in environments where there is adversity, chaos, threat, housing insecurity, all the things that go with poverty create a climate of anxiety and unpredictability and tension. And because of that, either an overt adversity like a sexual abuse, physical abuse, domestic violence, exposure to community violence, those big T trauma or the little t trauma, both of those experiences, as I will talk about in a minute, literally make it harder for a child to learn. Because the first thing that happens when you are a young child, or anybody, exposed to threat, is that you tend to shut down your cortex. Now, hold that for a minute. I'll come back and talk about that in a little bit more detail. But let me just go through this slide for 1 second, because if you understand this slide, you can understand ACEs. If you don't understand this slide, the correlation between early adversity and diabetes doesn't make any sense. I mean, you're like, what's the mechanism? How in the world does that influence the pancreas? And so the medical community for the longest time was highly skeptical of the ACE studies because they were not able in their brain to think of a mechanism by which early adversity, how is it that a kid who went through a divorce is going to have a higher probability of asthma? Tell me the mechanism. And the people who did this work didn't understand the mechanism because they're like, they weren't neuroscientists. They were a cardiologist and an internist, and they did not understand the neuroscience. But if you understand this slide, you will immediately understand ACEs. So let me just walk you through this. As I showed before, the brain has this hierarchy. There's these lower parts and the higher parts, and as you go from the functions mediated by different areas of the brain, you go from simpler functions up to these higher, more complex, most uniquely human functions. Now, think about it. Think about the complexity of getting 86 billion moving parts to work together in a synchronous way. It's a fundamental, complex challenge. It's really hard to do. And one of the neurobiological strategies, one of the microarchitectural strategies to help organize and integrate functioning across multiple parts of the brain is to have certain really, really important neural networks, not my head, slide please. Thank you. Really, really important neural networks that originate in lower parts of the brain and then send direct connections to every other part of the brain. And so there are these fundamentally important regulatory networks that originate in the low part of the brain. And you've heard of most of them: norepinephrine, noradrenergic, dopamine, serotonin, acetylcholine. And collectively, these neural networks go to every single part of the brain, and they also go out to every single organ in the body, both directly through the autonomic nervous system and indirectly through the neuroimmune system and the neuroendocrine system. And so this low part of your brain is essentially what we would called Grand Central Station. It is the backbone of the stress response. And I know those of you who've learned Trauma 101, you've learned all about cortisol and about the amygdala. And the amygdala has no direct input from the outside world. So the amygdala is part of this, right? But the amygdala acts because it gets input either top down from cortex or bottom up from these regulatory networks. This turns out to be incredibly important. It's incredibly important because anything that alters the organization and functioning of these neural networks will cause a cascade of vulnerability in every single part of the brain that they innervate and every single part of the body. i.e., this is why developmental adversity, which changes the sensitivity and reactivity of these neural networks, can influence your heart and your lung and your gut and your skin and your immune system and speech and language and your mood and anxiety. And so if you look at studies about developmental adversity, things that we know alter the sensitivity of these systems in ways that I'll show you in 1 minute, it's completely predictable that you'd expect these systems to be at increased risk for dysfunction. Not only is it not mysterious, it's completely predictable. And so it's no surprise then when somebody does a study and they look at, oh, people that have developmental adversity have a higher rate of difficulty with giving birth. They have a higher rate of eczema. They have higher rates of you can name any bad thing. Name any bad thing, and your probability for expressing that in adult life increases in a dose-dependent way with childhood adversity. So, 3 things that we know will, and adversity is not the only thing that can cause these systems to get messed up. 3 things that we know for sure will really, really influence these networks in a negative way and cause a cascade of problems. The first one is intrauterine insults, such as prenatal alcohol, prenatal meth, prenatal stress and distress of the mother will predictably alter the sensitivity and activity of these neural networks and lead to a cascade of problems that mimic the findings of the traditional ACE studies. The second thing is disruption of primary caregiving. If you have a mother who is the external stress regulator for the baby, and that mother is depressed, that mother's in a domestic violence relationship, that mother is high, absent, that anything that disrupts the ability of that caregiver to be present, attentive, attuned, and responsive to the baby leads to a pattern of dysregulation in the infant's stress response system, which then leads to a cascade of problems. And I'm going to come back and talk about how powerful that is in a moment. And then the third thing is what we would traditionally call adversity, these traumatic experiences. Now, because you are still paying attention, quite an attentive crowd, good for you. I'm going to tell you about the mechanism by which this happens. And I'm doing that at the risk of completely losing the audience. But I trust that you are engaged and you are going to find this useful. So here's what we're going to talk about. Well, let me do this first. All right, let me do this first. So this is the simple version of what happens to your brain when you get stressed. So if you remember that I had talked about these neural networks that were down here in these lower parts of the brain, right? And so when these lower parts of the brain, and what I didn't tell you was this. I mean, I probably should have, but I didn't. What I didn't tell you, and this is really important, is that every single visual, auditory, olfactory, tactile, every single sensory thing that comes into your body to help you interpret and understand this moment, the first place that that input comes is to the lowest and dumbest part of your brain. Now, the reason this is important is that so many of our interventions with dysregulated and acting out or behavioral problem kids in schools and in prisons and everything else has this weird idea that their behavior is motivated from top down, that they knew better and they still did it. And that is a fundamental misunderstanding of how the brain works. And so here's the way the brain works. This lowest part of your brain down here, the part of your brain that cannot tell time, this part of your brain, when information comes into that part of your brain can tell whether or not this is an experience as an infant or a 5-year-old or a 50-year-old. This is why a Vietnam vet, when they're 70 years old, they hear a car backfire, they can literally have a physiological response and feel like they need to take shelter. Because this part of the brain can't tell time. And earlier in that person's life, that part of the brain made an association between loud, unexpected noises and the need to take cover and threat and danger. And so that association still exists in his brain. And by the time the information gets to the part of his brain up here that can tell time, first of all, the reactive part of the brain has been able to act on that information. The emotional part of the brain has acted on that information. And now the rational part of the brain gets a chance to act on that information. But here's what happens. As soon as that information comes in, and here he is sitting relaxing with his grandchild, and somebody shoots a firecracker off in the base, in the backyard, within a millisecond, this is the way his brain works. He's activated a stress response. And the first thing that happens when you activate an intense stress response is that you deactivate certain parts of the cortex, including the part of the cortex that tells time. So he can get caught literally for a second or two in a loop where his brain feels like he's in Vietnam. That's what we call a flashback. And then as he sort of gets grounded and feels a little bit better, he starts to sort of open up a little bit more and then a little bit more. And then he realizes that, wow, I feel like this because somebody shot off a firecracker, those damn kids, blah, blah, blah. And he still feels crappy. But for that moment, and I don't know how many of you have ever had a moment like that, when you are in that state, a second or 2 seconds feels like a long time. Now, so the first thing that happens is that when you're threatened, or when your stress response system is activated, it starts to shut down your cortex. And when you're really, really, really activated, you literally get to the point where you're not even using cortical processing. You're sort of in the moment acting in these very self-preservation, almost animalistic-like ways. So when you have these kids that have these tantrums and these meltdowns, and they're on the floor crying and screaming and rocking, and all you wanted to do is have them do a transition, you're like, what in the hell? They act like you're going to kill them. Like, I'm not asking you to go to hell. I mean, we're not crossing the sticks here. We're just going to go into a different room for dinner. But to their brain, their brain feels like you really are going to do something very, very catastrophic to them. And their brain distorts the present. And this, again, is one of the biggest problems. These kids didn't make the plan that, when the mom comes and asks me to go have dinner, I'm going to have a major shitstorm. See how that goes over. They don't plan that. That's an elicited behavior. Just like when you accidentally touch a hot stove, you remove your hand before you even know what burned your finger. Human beings almost always behave before they think. And I know we have this fantasy about think before you behave. The reality is most of us behave before we think. So, let's back back to this stress response thing a little bit here. Now, first thing I'm going to say is that I don't want you to be afraid of stress. Stress is actually good for you. Stress has gotten a really, really bad name. And I think the mental health field is really, bears a lot of that responsibility. It does. I mean, we've talked about stress like it's a bad thing. Stress is actually the best thing in the world. And I am honestly I'm not kidding or joking one bit. You cannot get better at anything unless you are stressed. You cannot develop if you are not stressed. You cannot learn a new thing unless you are stressed. You will not become resilient without stress. The key is the pattern of stress. And so if you have stressors that are unpredictable, you have no control over what's going on in your world. If you have stressors that are extreme or prolonged, you'll end up with an abnormally regulated stress response system that becomes overactive and overly reactive, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But this is where the good news is. If you understand the neurobiology of stress, what you immediately recognize is that there's a 30-year history in the neurosciences of showing us how to, number one, take an abnormally organized stress response system and make it more neurotypically organized, and number two, how to take a neurotypically organized stress response system and make it resilient. And it's through predictable, moderate, controllable stressors. The concept of is incredibly important to understand. Now, there's a couple of nuances to this that I may or may not get a chance to go into, but let me just walk you through something that it kind of, I think, explains this stuff. I'm going to, again, like I said, I'm going to show you some science. This is actually stuff that was from when I was 30 years ago when I was a neuroscience person. I did some of this work in animal models. But here's what I want you to just see. If you take an individual who's sort of pretty well regulated, at baseline they're not tuned up and they're not over anxious and they're not sort of completely shut down. They've got a neurotypical stress response capability. And you give them a moderate stress, like giving a presentation in front of the governor's wife, they're just saying, it's like, you have a moderate activation of your stress response. And so it will activate. It will get into this moderate activation level, and then at some point the presentation will be over, and I'll get back to my baseline. Might take a beer or two, but I'll be fine. Just kidding. So, a couple weeks later, you can have another moderate stress. And everybody, in school, if you perform in sports, if you're in the school band, if you're in a play, you have these moderate stressor experiences. And these are good for you. Now, here's what happens. If you have a child who has a moderate stressor, they're neurotypically organized right here. And I'll give you an example. I could give thousands of examples. This is a pretty typical example. Little boy lives with his mom. When he was first, his father left when he was young. He loves school. Things have been fine at home. Mom has had a couple boyfriends in and out a little bit, but mostly dated, nothing really negative or toxic. So this is a neurotypically organized kid going to a typical public school. He's I think he's in the second grade, the child I'm thinking of. Comes home, does well on his test, has a moderate activation wants to perform well, kind of gets a little bit nervous about it, does okay. On his way home, before he gets back to his baseline, he sees a pair of men's shoes sitting outside the back door. And that's a little bit unfamiliar. And one thing I didn't say is that unfamiliar cues, novelty, activates your stress response, even if it's just a little bit. But see, when it activates just a little bit on the heels of being tuned up, what will happen is this will be your response. And he walks in the door and he sees a man who scowls at him. A strange man sitting at a kitchen table with his mom, scowls at him, and he hasn't gotten back to baseline, and he's a little bit uncomfortable. And the guy says something like, "What is he doing here?" in a hostile way. And she says, "This is my son. He's coming home from school." And he's not happy about that because he thought he was going to get lucky, and here comes this kid. And so the little boy goes back into his room. He's like, "What's going on? This guy was mean." And then he hears yelling because mom was trying to defend the little boy. He goes out into the kitchen, and he's really scared now, and he tries to stand up for his mom. And the guy scowls at him and says, "Get out of here," and then hits his, sort of is rough with his mom, doesn't really hit her. But all of this stuff gets him into this state. He's fearful. And then the guy spends the night, and the kid goes back to school and has another test the next day. And in a subject where he would normally get an A, this kid didn't even finish all of the answers. This is a sensitizing pattern of stress activation, unpredictable, uncontrollable. And this happens to kids that live in environments where there's poverty, where there's community violence, where there's housing insecurity, food insecurity. And so what happens is, as this system gets more and more activated, this is what happens. You begin to lose the normal linear relationship between external threat or external challenge and internal response. I'm about to describe for you mechanisms that underlie the achievement gap. The achievement gap isn't about the color of your skin. It's about the degree of distress in your world. And so here's a child. This is you and I, maybe. We have a little bit of moderate stress, which is completely predictable in work or school. We're able to stay active alert. We still have access to lots of our cortex. We can internalize new content. We can retrieve old content. So we do just fine in a workplace. We do just fine in the classroom. But if you have been this child or adult who has a sensitized stress response, you have the typical challenges of work or school, and your brain basically is walking around like you're under threat, which means that you're not using all of your cortex, which means that you will learn, but you'll learn at a much slower rate than other kids. You'll need 4 repetitions to master the same stuff that other kids get in 2 repetitions. And pretty soon you fall further and further behind. This is showing you the same thing. Whoops. Basically, what will happen is optimal development, optimal teaching, optimal parenting, optimal therapy requires leaving your comfort zone, getting into this Goldilocks place where there's not too much stress, but there's enough stress. And this is what healthy development is all about. This is what, if you're interested in competition in sports, in fact, we work with a lot of athletes and athletic teams about stuff like this. You want to get better at competition, you've got to practice at speed with moderate stressor. It's not the same as the game, but you've got to have enough stressors so that you actually begin to develop resilience for those conditions. But what happens with these poor kids that we work with, and many of you work with, if they're sensitized, a dose that's completely appropriate for this child is an overwhelming dose for this child. And so what education and therapy becomes is understanding these concepts of dosing and spacing. Now, one of the things that I'm actually very happy about being in Arizona today about is that we are about to start a large project with the Arizona Board of Education about introducing some of these concepts about trauma, understanding trauma, and helping create more developmentally aware environments in classrooms so educators can better understand how to dose and space in ways that can help these kids catch up and in ways that will minimize behavioral acting out that will inevitably arise from a child who is in a fight or flight state. So, now, talked a little bit about this. Let me talk about the good news. Here's the good news. Because of the malleability of the brain, the very same pattern of neural activity, the very same systems that underlie sensitivity are going to be responsive to this is labeled a resilience building pattern, but this is also a therapeutic pattern if you're tuned up, right? So if you're dysregulated and hypersensitive and overly reactive, you want that to change. So here's what we know, is that if you take an individual who is tuned up and they're dysregulated right here, like these kids I showed earlier, and you give them a moderate dose, it's completely overwhelming and they melt down, it's a disaster. They melt down, they either flee or they fight or they shut down. It's not good. But if there's a tolerable dose of challenge and there's an adequate spacing for them to kind of get back to their baseline, and then you have another opportunity for them to determine what the moderate dose of challenge is, these kids can ultimately start to have neurotypical organization. And so that a child who is sensitized, if they have moderate, predictable, controllable doses, can heal and then ultimately become resilient. Now, what are the essential elements of this? What is one of these things? Just keep that question in mind, and I'm going to show you a little science here, some other research here. First of all, I would like to thank you guys. You're very attentive for sitting for so long. You're either that or you're the best dissociators in the planet. Probably a combination of both. All right. So let me just take a minute and talk about this. There's two things I want to talk about. One is that, and it's related to the work that we've done with the people who did the original ACE study. And I'll find that in here in a minute. We have had the good fortune of having lots of good working relationships with colleagues all over the world. As I said before, we're part of this big network, and one of the things that we've been able to do is have these wonderful, productive, collaborative partnerships and relationships. And I've written an article about the mechanisms that may underlie the observations from the ACE studies, and I wrote it with the authors of the ACE study. And so, you all know that here are the 10 adversities that were part of that epidemiological study. And again, I just want to emphasize that the ACE inventory it can be a really useful thing for looking at epidemiological sort of correlations. And so, oops. I don't know. Let me get rid of that. I don't know why that's there. I'm sure I did something wrong here. Maybe I should. Oh, it did? Well, let me just make it go away for sure. Okay. All right. I think I made it go away for sure. All right. All right. So the original ACE study, as you know, had these, or may not know, but those of you who do know, those of you who don't know, there are these 10 items. And what they do is they take a bunch of adults, at least in the original study, and say, hey, did any of these things happen to you any time in your life? And those of you who are clinicians know that that's kind of a broad question. Like not a lot of specificity about, when did it happen? How many times did it happen? Just if it happened, you endorse it and you get a check. And so when you do that, you get this really, really powerful dose-dependent relationship between your ACE score and then bad things in adult life. And so when I say bad things, this is what, like I said earlier, if you look at physical health problems, suicidality, substance abuse, mental health problems, etc., literally any bad thing. So the more adverse experiences you have, the more at risk you are for manifesting multiple of these bad outcomes. Now, being a clinician and knowing a lot about development of the brain, I knew that there were a couple of things here that the ACE study was not honing in on that are really important. Number one is, I know that there are people who had bad things happen to them and they're actually functioning relatively well. And I know people that didn't have that many bad things, if at all, happen to them, and they're really struggling. So I know that, number one, your ACE score is not this inevitability. It's not, these studies don't determine causality. It's about risk. Your risk changes. And so one of the things that I knew was really important in our work that we'd seen was that connectedness, relationships made a big difference. And so here's what we did. We went back and we started to look at people who had adversity, and then we looked at how connected they were. If people had a history of being connected to others, healthy relationships in the family, healthy relationships in school, community, healthy connection to culture, those individuals were to some degree buffered from the impact of adversity. So if you could have as many as 4 ACE items endorsed, but if you had relational wealth, you didn't begin to demonstrate risk until you got over 4. In contrast, if you had no ACE items, but you had relational poverty, disconnection from family, disconnection from culture, disconnection from community, you were at risk for demonstrating 2 of these bad outcomes. Now, one of the things that we've done over the years is develop this model to look at the timing and the nature of developmental adversity and the timing and the nature of developmental health. And we have built a network of clinicians and clinical teams all over the world who have learned how to do an assessment as part of their clinical work that looks at the timing and the nature of bad things and the timing and the nature of these relational health items. And we look at them as a function of these different age groups, intrauterine, the first 2 months of life, the first year of life, and so forth. So we're able to look at not only the timing of adversity, but we're able to look at the timing of these relational health items. And so let me just show you a few things that we found. One of the things that we found, and I'm just going to say it, I'm not going to show it because it's, it's just too much science. Not that you couldn't do it. I don't have enough time. It's me, not you. So what we basically found was that when you were, and this isn't what this graph is about, but what we basically found was when you look at risk for bad outcomes, that your history of developmental connectedness is a better predictor than your history of adversity. And I think anybody who does clinical work has seen that. And those of you who think about the people you know in your life who are struggling the most and the people that have had hard things and are doing okay, you'll start to do the math. You'll see the same thing. People that have had other people connected in an enduring way in their life do better. Now, here's the other thing that we found, and this is a very sobering thing. And on one hand, it's very positive, and on one hand, it's very challenging. So let me just explain it, and then we'll talk through it. So the first thing that we do with this measure that we have is, as I said, we have a way to measure adversity, and we have a way to measure this relational health thing. And so the balance between these two gives us what we call the developmental risk factor. So if you have a lot of bad things and no relational buffer, that's high developmental risk. And if you have lots of connectedness and no adversity, that's low developmental risk. Make sense? Okay. So then we took a group, and we've done this with kids, we've done this with adults, we've done this with teens, we've done this with children 11 to 13, but we're using the 11 to 13 because we published this, and it's a big N number. So we looked at a bunch of kids that are 11 to 13, and we measured their current functioning. And basically, we have a way to sum up their functioning using this total score. And it's basically a measure of how well organized and functioning various brain-mediated things are. Attention, mood regulation, fine motor control, and so forth. Stuff that in the mental health field, you kind of know what I'm talking about. So here's what we did. If you take the group that had low development, now these are all kids that are in a clinical population. They presented to one of our, we have got 2,500 clinicians all over the world using this model. So they presented to one of our several hundred sites across the world to get help. So they're a clinical population. These aren't neurotypical individuals. So if they had low developmental risk from birth forward, they had a score in this brain sort of function category that was about 70% of what you would expect in neurotypical kids, which is not great, but it's, that's what we got. And that's probably why they were presenting for mental health services. So if you took a group that had high developmental risk in the first 2 months of life and then all the way until they were 11 to 13, this is their score. They were about 54% of functioning of a neurotypical kid. So they had more dysfunction in more systems. Now here's the interesting stuff. And it fits completely with what we know about how the brain develops, but it's a very sobering thing to see. If you take the group of kids who had high risk in the first 2 months of life and then were removed, and almost all of these are a groups of kids that entered our foster care systems or were adopted. Now, let me just show you what we see. Their score is essentially the same as if there'd been adversity through the whole time period, which is pretty sobering, right? Now, anybody who works in this field knows this. You see this. You can see kids that were adopted by wonderful parents at 2 months, and these kids end up having reading problems, attention problems, behavior problems, social problems. It's like, what the hell? And in part, this is because the first 2 months of life are so crucial for organizing these stress response systems I've been talking about, and because they're involved in so many functions. As you get older, these systems play a major role in organizing these other upstream systems that have to do with thinking and feeling and behaving and so forth. Here's what I want to tell you. I am completely convinced that when our child welfare systems and foster homes and mental health communities become more trauma-informed, that will not be the same finding. But that's why that number is low, I think, currently. Now, here's the good news. Kids that had the first 2 months of life with low developmental risk and then the wheels fell off their family, their outcomes were as good as the kids who had low developmental risk all the way through. This speaks very, very strongly for the wisdom of aggressive early intervention programs for both pregnant and then early childhood programming with young parents who have young kids. You literally, if a parent, at least from this, in the first 2 months, if there is an adequate level of attention and attunement and responsivity to the infant, that has an inoculating impact that protects these kids from tremendous developmental risk for the next 10 years. This is, again, very consistent with the findings of people that study high-quality home visitation models. And this, if you want bang for your buck, this is a really important finding. Now, this isn't with a few kids. This is a study on over 6,000 kids, and we've replicated this now with 10,000 kids. We've got, like I said, we have clinicians all over the world that are adding to this core data set, and we have an N right now of over 50,000 kids. And as we continue to build that, we'll be able to look more carefully at some of the nuances related to this. But this is, in my mind, the most hopeful finding of our work. And what it really speaks to is this, is that, you know, independent of your model, independent of your evidence-based practice, if you are able to create a relational connection to the child and to the people who care for the child, the parent, the teacher, the early child care provider, if they can stay regulated, they can help these children in ways that will have enduring impact. It will decrease their risk for school problems. It'll decrease their risk for mental health problems. It'll decrease the probability they enter the juvenile justice system. And despite the fact that we are having these one-size-fits-all models, they'll be able to do better. And so back to this whole one-size-fits-all model thing, these are the kids that have these, begin to have the achievement gap because they're from chaos, stress, distress, threat. And what will happen is they're chronologically 5, but because their cortex has been relatively shut down, even if they're hearing words, they're not internalizing them the same way. But we tend to be pretty bad at looking at individuals, kids as individuals. And so this is what happens. This is what happens with things that we even measure. So if you start to fall behind, we're terrible at catching you up. This is with stuff that we measure in it and that we're teaching to and that we are explicitly valuing. But think about what happens with things that we aren't measuring and that we aren't explicitly valuing, like the ability to form and maintain relationships, the capacity to be empathic, the capacity for self-regulation. We don't measure those things in ways, in a systematic way. So here's what happens. These kids that fall behind start to get these labels. We view them through the lens of mental health. And the traditional mental health world does not understand developmental trauma. We tend to give them multiple diagnostic labels. We tend to use medications. And if that medication doesn't work, we add another medication. And so we have this crisis of poor psychopharmacology practice, particularly in kids in foster care, where they get over-medicated, the medications are ineffective. We're reassured by the people who have the highest doctoral degrees that this is the right thing. And the irony is, in the evidence-based world, these people are practicing in ways where there's not a shred of evidence. I can guarantee you there's not a shred of evidence that any of the psychotropic drugs that we use on a routine basis with these kids have been effectively shown to be useful or effective in kids that have complex trauma. In large part because the studies we use to track this stuff, we exclude those complex kids from those studies. What we do know is that if you give kids those medications like Risperdal and other antipsychotic medications, you increase their risk for cardiometabolic problems. So again, it's one of these things where it's well-intended, but it's developmentally ignorant. It's neuroscience ignorant. We're making kids get diabetes from our intervention as opposed to have decreased impulse control. And then if you're a child of color, this is what happens. The very same kids that were struggling in pre-K and accumulate diagnostic labels. You know, this kid I showed you before, the kid who murdered all these people? He'd had 12 different mental health evaluations and been given 15 different neuropsychiatric diagnoses and had been tried on over 20 medications. And then he got old enough that his disruptive behaviors, his fight or flight behaviors, were pathologized and then criminalized. And so when he tried to leave a classroom and a teacher put hands on him and he resisted and the teacher got hurt, he was charged with assault. If somebody goes up to you on the street and grabs your arm and tries to stop you from walking, they're the person that we charge with assault. Our misunderstanding of these kids is feeding the school to prison pipeline. Oh. Thank you. If nominated, I will not run, and if elected, I will not serve. That's an old Lyndon Johnson joke for those of you. Anyway, all right. So the good news is that this doesn't have to be. You know, we've seen in many, many places that when schools and teachers, teachers want to help these kids. When they are armed with the knowledge about what these behaviors are about, when they're given strategies to regulate these kids instead of just punish them, we see incredibly different outcomes. I could give you a whole bunch of other data, but one of my favorite stories is from an elementary school in Columbus, Ohio, where there were kids in that community. 50% of them the year before had been homeless at some point, and it was a very poor community. This one sticks out because I just could not believe the number of kids, the numbers I was hearing. So this school had 2,000 referrals to the principal's office. Think about it, in elementary school, and only 5% of these kids achieved the Ohio academic standard testing, competence levels that were expected for their third graders. 1 year after bringing in some of these concepts, the number of visits to the principal went down to 200, and the number of kids in the third grade that passed the competency test was 58%. And we're seeing the same thing in Tasmania, Scotland, South Africa, all throughout North America. When you give well-intended, bright people the right knowledge base and a few tools, they take their own creativity, they take their own energy, they take their own efforts, and they make positive change. And we've seen this happen in child welfare settings, mental health settings, juvenile justice settings, early childhood settings, education settings, and we are, because of that, hopeful. And I think that one of the things that you're going to see in this community, every person who spoke alluded to the growth of awareness about these concepts. I can tell you right now that in this state, there are many, many, many very good initiatives underway that are helping spread these concepts. And I'm confident, particularly with the support of the governor and the governor's wife and all of this senior leadership and in your major departments that live and work with kids, that you're going to not only be able to make these changes, I'm pretty confident you're going to be able to invent new ways to do this work. Because that's what it's going to take. It's going to take places like this who have the intention and the relationships to start to think about problem solving in a different way. This isn't about having, new font or a new department name or finding an evidence-based program to make everybody have. The reality is our evidence base is scant in child mental health. We need to have evidence-generating practice so that we learn from what we're doing. And as we learn, we self-correct. And once we start to do that, the rate at which we can make new innovations is going to be accelerated. And I think that this is the kind of place where that can happen. And I am grateful for the opportunity to be part of some of those initiatives in this state. And I would just encourage all of you to not give up. not get too discouraged by the inevitable roadblocks that you will see. Roadblocks, just cross the road, so do a little cross-country work and get around the roadblocks. It reminds me of a story. I was working with the FBI on this thing. There was a bank robbery, and then there was a high-speed chase, and the police had set up a roadblock in the cul-de-sac. And so here they were telling me about this. I was doing a debriefing of a shooting that happened there, and they were talking, the police officers were just so surprised that these people who had robbed the bank and shot a bunch of people dared to drive over lawns. Oh, Jesus. I was like, shocking. Thought putting the car right at the end of the cul-de-sac. We got them now. They came speeding down the road. They saw the roadblock, and they're like, oh, they just went over the lawns. They're like, what? Whoa! Anyway, so on that note, I want to thank you for your attention, your work, and I look forward to hearing about how you make progress over the years. Thank you.